Hi, everyone. You know what's great about the fall? It's when we have our updates, the new code sets drop, and it's time to go over the ICD-10-PCS updates. We're going to talk about all the new codes today, and we're looking at 2022. It's very exciting. So let's get started because there's a lot of information to go over. There were 191 new codes, and that's predominantly what we're going to cover. There was only 63 revised codes and 107 deleted codes. Now, the thing about new codes is that with most code sets, whenever you get a new code, that means that then you get the deleted code. That's why a code was deleted, is because they expanded and created a new code. That doesn't always happen with PCS because PCS is a different format of a code set. And so one little change will knock it out, not like with ICD-10 or even CPT. So we are predominantly going to look at the new codes, and then I'm going to briefly show you the revised codes and the deleted codes. We use Find a Code. That's the best encoder that I've worked with through the years, and I was able to use them to get the information for this. And if you guys are using Find a Code, know that you get the new code sets. Well, the first thing we need to see is a little refresher about PCS and how it's divided up. So the first thing is the section, then we have the body system, root operation, body part approach, device, and qualifier. For the most part, sometimes on the 6th and 7th characters, they are not applicable for what we're dealing with. And even sometimes the 5th character, the approach, but we will always use the 1, 2, 3, 4. That is very applicable to everything that we'll be doing. And section, for the most part, the majority, well, I would say more than the majority, I would say 95% of all of the new codes were in med surg this time. Now, it is interesting to compare this year's changes to the previous presentation that we did. We had a little overview in 21, and in 20 there was a massive amount of changes, and there was like over 700 new codes, and of course we don't have that this year. And I think one of the reasons we can explain that is that the code set is easily changeable, but now that it's been out for a while, it is adaptable, but we're covering everything in what we have now. And ultimately, you can't run out with PCS. I tell everybody I suspect PCS will eventually take over CPT, and now that medical decision making in E&M is so different than it was before, so we will be looking at mostly section 1 for the changes, and of course root operations 1 and 3. The characters 1 and 3 are once you understand characters 1 and 3, you're not going to have any problems with this code set whatsoever. So I'm going to highlight that throughout our presentation. We're not going to go over any guideline changes, but where the codes are in the manuals, and when you look up the codes, then you'll see the guidelines. There wasn't a lot to speak of that were changes. The first area, and we're just doing alphanumeric, that's how it was listed. And so we're going to look at the med surg first because it starts with the O, and the first root operation that's covered in the new codes is extraction. If you can't remember what extraction is defined by, the root operation, it's pulling or stripping out of all or a portion of a body part by the use of force. Extraction. Now, if you get the root operations under your belt, again, PCS is no problem. So you notice we have OO, and again, remember the previous slide, the graph. Let's just go back and look at that again. Body system, right? So we have med surge, the body system is O, and then root operation and body part. So OOD, all of these are D codes because they're extractions. And then it's what area are we working in? Well, everything here is around the brain. So the first three codes are brain, and the next three are cerebral hemisphere, again, all around the brain. And then the next area that we're looking in the codes are the approach. And that is going to be the um, let's see, I started to go backwards, but if you look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth character gives you approach. And one thing when we go through these, we'll go through some of them pretty fast because it's pretty repetitious, except for, say, the approach. And almost always your approaches are going to be open, percutaneous, endoscopic. And notice that on these codes, what are we doing? We're doing an extraction of the brain in that area of the brain, and then the approach is listed three different types of approach. And guess what? Sure enough, cerebral hemisphere, same thing, open, percutaneous, and percutaneous endoscopic. Um, but I'll bring one more little tidbit to the uh, the way the code sets set up. That 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth character. Notice that it's 034 and then it's 034 again, right? Because that is approach, open, percutaneous, and percutaneous endoscopic. Now, the last two characters are Z because they're not applicable. Z is sort of like an X with, it's kind of a placement where it's not applicable. So the O000 stands for brain, 777, cerebral hemisphere each time, and then that next character is the approach. Okay. Let's look at what we've got next. Extirpation. This is not a term we use very often. And if you didn't know what extirpation was, it's taking or cutting out, and you're going to take out solid matter in a body part. It can be anywhere in the body without taking out any of the body part, right? So again, that's a little unique. And the root operations don't translate the same in CPT. It's really about the intent. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time explaining all of this information I'm giving you now. I'm going to give you less and less of that as we go along, because honestly, we've done education on this. We teach PCS, and that should already be under your belt. So if you want more information about root operations in PCS, you can go look at our YouTube channel, Medical Coding Cert, or you can look at the courses that we offer where we talk about this extensively, and we have a lot of information on PCS in the club. But again, I wanted to just kind of highlight some of this because I can't help regurgitating it. It's fun stuff. I love this code set quite a bit. So this with new codes, all of these are new codes. Med surge, again, extirpation. We are going to be looking at the matter from a coronary artery. And so we're taking out something solid from the coronary artery. And then it's one artery, orbital atherectomy technique. And then notice all of these are percutaneous approaches, right? So notice it's 3, 3, 3, 3 because it's all the same. And then it's two arteries, three arteries, four or more arteries. Okay, so we have one artery, and then if they deal with more, then that's how the code set is changing for us. What about fragmentation? Just a little refresher on the new fragmentation codes. We're breaking up solid matter in a body part into pieces. This is the new codes are in coronary artery, the same thing, 1, 2, 3, 4 or more arteries, and percutaneous approach on all of them. If you think about this, what procedure would they be doing where they're fragmenting something, breaking up solid in an artery, right? They're doing some type of atherectomy where they're going in and rotor-rooting out. So again, the we aren't using the same verbiage as with CPT. This is actually better in the long run. And this is how the providers talk when they are describing the procedures. Moving on to the new codes of replacement, and that's defined as putting in or on biological or synthetic material to take a place of a body part. So we will be working with the heart, and we're going to it's heart with biological and synthetic substitute. Now, auto-regulated and electrohydraulic. Now, I didn't go in and look and see what this was. We could go look that up. But again, we're putting something in the heart that is biological and synthetic at the same time. And it's regulated by the body itself, and it's electrohydraulic. Now, our approaches are open or percutaneous approach. We also have heart with synthetic substitute that's pneumatic, and then we can replace the valves. So pulmonary valve with zooplastic tissue in existing conduit, as well as in native site. I just went ahead and highlighted those characters that were changing so that it would make sense to you. I did that less and less as we go along. Yeah, fragmentation. Deborah said clots, kidney stones, and Jane said bladder and kidneys. Absolutely, you're correct. That's for that fragmentation. So restrictions. Now, the new codes for restriction in med-surg is we have the left ventricle. So we're going to be able to code restricting the left ventricle. And how are we doing it? Extraluminal, intraluminal, and devices that we could be used, or we aren't using a device, we're just using an open approach. Now, I thought I'd just remind everybody what intraluminal device is. It's going into a blood vessel or a lumen, which is a tube. That's and they're putting in things like stents. Now, if you're doing extraluminal, it's outside the lumen, outside of the vessel, such as putting like a clip and closing it off. One of the examples, of course, this is left ventricle, but when they go in and put clips on fallopian tubes, yeah. So that would be an example of extraluminal occlusion. Now, if you are doing an embolization, that is going to completely close off the vessel. So that actually is an occlusion operation, and a restriction is when you're going to narrow a lumen or a tube. Okay, just thought I'd add that in there because we are going to talk about occlusions here in a little bit. Restriction of the left ventricle, we have extraluminal and intraluminal, and then notice that we have the different approaches: percutaneous, and we have percutaneous endoscopic, but we also have some that don't use a device, and that would be percutaneous approach and percutaneous endoscopic approach, right? So you have to be careful when you're looking at the definitions. Moving on to bypasses that were done for med-surg. Bypass means that we're going to have one or more anastomosis, and an anastomosis is where you're attaching with or without the use of a device. So they are have added two new codes for bypass of a right brachial artery and a left brachial artery in the lower arm vein, and it's percutaneous approach, and that right and left is defined by 7 and 8 on these two codes. Now, I mentioned occlusion. So one of the new occlusion area codes that they've added for med-surg is for things like hemorrhoidal plexus, and this is rectal hemorrhoids. And again, notice that it's extraluminal or intraluminal devices. And then we have different approach via natural or artificial, but they are artificial opening or artificial opening endoscopic. Endoscopic just means we're going in and we're looking at the same time, if you didn't know. More on occlusions, we can also do lower veins. And again, we have different devices. We can do extraluminal, intraluminal, and then the artificial openings or natural opening, and then endoscopic. Extraction. They it's really interesting that there's a lot of new codes for bone marrow. So extracting of bone marrow. We in the past they had like one code that you could build out, but they've really fleshed this out and given us more codes. So ultimately, what are we extracting? Bone marrow. How are we going to access that? We can do open approach diagnostic. Now, and then we have open approach, and then we have percutaneous approach and diagnostic. The game changer here is the term diagnostic, because what does diagnostic mean? You can put it in the chat. That means we're going in to look for something specifically. We know that there's a problem, so we're going in to find out how to identify it. What do they usually look for in bone marrow? They're looking for blood components. So if a person has a problem with the amount of cells, blood component and cells that they're producing, not always per se platelets, but yes, platelets are tracked, but red blood cells and white blood cells, both, those are all made in the bone marrow. So they'll go in, they'll tap usually the pelvis, and they will extract some of that fluid, and then they'll be able to look at under microscope. Jane's got it, diagnostic to look to solve the illness. So if we have a really low white blood count, and they've done all the testing and they're not quite sure what they need to, what's causing it, they'll go in, they'll tap the pelvis, they'll pull out some bone marrow, and if then they see, hey, the body's not producing it, the bone marrow is not doing its job, and that's where you start getting things like a diagnosis of leukemia or anaplastic disorders and stuff. They'll also look at they'll look at all the blood components that way. Now we have in med surge, we have division, division of the liver. Well, we really gained a lot of opportunities here. So what I did was I broke the codes down to just make it easier for you to see it. And we have division of the liver, just the liver as one organ, then the right lobe and the left lobe. And then it's just repetitious. Open approach, percutaneous approach, and percutaneous endoscopic approach. Endoscopic just means we go in and we visualize with a camera at the same time we go in. So the OF8, 0 for the liver, 1 for the right lobe of the liver, and 2 for left lobe of liver. And to see how the code set just repeats itself. It's so simple, so easy to use. Then we have another division of tongue, palate, pharynx, or pharynx muscle, and this is going to be via natural artificial opening. But one of the divisions of the tongue, they go in, and you remember how they do they clip the tongue on babies. None of my children had to have that done, but one of my grandbabies had to have that done, I remember. So that's 088 OK847 ZZ. They added a lot of insertion codes for the body area of the skull. So if we need to insert something and we're going to infuse, we're going to use an infusion device into the skull, and then it gives us the different approaches. That's how you know which code to use is via the approach. And again, it's open, percutaneous, and percutaneous endoscopic. It's just so repetitious through all of those. I'm not going to read those off anymore. I'm just going to say it's the common approaches. You can see them. And Jane said, is that a hair lip too? Yeah, they can go in and repair that with those same codes on that previous one. Correct. Reposition. Now, we're going to go through these root operations and you're going to see them again and again. However, you're going to see them listed all in med surge. Then we're going to see them in the other areas, but also body systems. So they'll repeat as it rolls, because PCS is just like turning blocks. When you turn this block, then that makes a difference in all the other blocks that turn. And if you turn it different, then these blocks change and turn differently. So it's they call it multi-axial is how it works. It's just a lot of fun. So we are infusing using an infusion device into the skull, and then we can also reposition. This is going to be the thoracic vertebra with spinal stabilization device, and it's going to be on the vertebral body tether. Uh, and then the next one is the same, except for it's a different approach. So we only have two approaches. We have open and percutaneous endoscopic. So again, we don't have here percutaneous approach. If you go in, you have to see it. And if we do open approach, you can visualize it. And percutaneous approach by itself, you can't visualize. Well, you don't go around messing with the spinal column without being able to visualize. So it's not even an option. So percutaneous endoscopic approach is available. New codes for excisions. Note that these excisions are happening to the sigmoid bones or sesamoid bones. We've got right metatarsal and left metatarsal. And where are our metatarsals? Does anybody know where the metatarsals are? They're the toes. It's in the description, first toe. And then we have different approaches. So now we're able to excise the sesamoid bone from the left or right foot or toes. We can also reposition the lumbar vertebra with a spinal stabilization device, much like the code that we saw on the previous slide, only this is a reposition. Removal. Well, now we're looking at a shoulder joint. And again, this is all in med-surg. We are now able to code for taking out or removing that synthetic substitute from the right shoulder joint. Now, notice here, this is a little different because the code has the different approaches, but it's the different areas of that shoulder joint. Humeral surface and glenoid surface. I've got a picture of a shoulder joint here in just a minute that we'll look at. And then I went ahead and didn't redo all of that. I just showed you the different codes because it's repetitious. The right is mirrors the left. The descriptions are all the same, and we're just tweaking. Notice the J is for the right, K's are for the left, but otherwise everything else predominantly stays the same. That's what happens. What's so easy about laterality. So here we go. See that humeral area that we mentioned in the previous slide? And this is now for the right shoulder joint and the left shoulder joint, but we're doing a revision. What are we revising? A synthetic substitute. What's the synthetic substitute? Now, these are very similar to what we just looked at, and it's repetitious, so I didn't fill this all out again. But on the left, you'll notice that's a normal shoulder, okay? And they don't have anything wrong with that shoulder. Then the next is anatomic replacement, and then a reverse replacement, but they're all synthetic substitutes. That is a synthetic substitute. So when a person has a shoulder joint replaced, a hip, a knee, all that is synthetic substitute. So now we're doing a revision. We're going in and revising that artificial joint. Okay, now we're moving on to administration. Okay, we finally got through med-surg. That was a lot. The first character is always an O in med-surg, and that's the largest area of PCS. Okay, now there wasn't changes in everything. So 1 and 2, we didn't have any changes, but administration, we did have some new codes. So the first one is transfusion. Notice it starts with a 3 because in PCS, for administration, that first character is a 3. And then we have O2, which tells us the body area, right? And the 2 is transfusion. So what are we doing? Non-autologous pathogen reduced cryoprecipitated fibrogen complex into peripheral vein or central vein. That's the two things that we can do. Man, that's a mouthful. Isn't that fun to say? All right, then we can do an irrigation in administration, because what is an irrigation? Yeah, we're administering something into the body, a liquid. We're flushing out something. That's an administration. So peritoneal cavity using irrigating substance. It can be anything. Then we have our approach, but just like the previous codes, they're the same except for one's diagnostic and one's not. And Jane had already said that diagnostic to look and solve the illness. That's why we're doing it. So if you know that it's diagnostic, then it would be 3E1M48X. But if it's just to go in there and clean something out, then it's 3E1M48Z. Very, very important. Then we move on, we jump to measurement and monitoring. So we're no longer doing med surg, we're not doing administration. We are now doing measurement and monitoring. And this is a pretty good sized area too, but not near as big as med surg. And it's 4. That starts with a 4. So 4B00XW0, what are we measuring? Central nervous cerebral spinal fluid shunt using wireless sensor external approach. And I just thought I would put a little clip in there from the Mayo Clinic. And if you didn't know what spinal fluid is supposed to look like, it's clear, like in those little vials, and that's exactly what they put them in. But if it's cloudy, that means there's a problem. If it's got yellowing or red, of course, that's absolutely a problem. But it should be very, very clear, and it also should be. Not only is it clear, it should be. It's not as watery. I think it has a little bit of stickiness to it, but it's clear. It protects the spinal cord. Then we move to 5, which is extracorporeal or systemic assistance in performance. There was only one code added this year, 5A1221J, performance of cardiac output to continuous automated. So again, what are we doing? We're checking the performance of how well the heart is working, and it's continuous and automated, so it would be a built-in system of some kind. And I just added this graphic because I thought this was interesting to add to your knowledge base of why do we look at cardiac output in the first place. So now we can code and track that. Then we move to imaging. We've already gone through over half of the first characters, and now it switches to letters instead of numbers. PCS does that. It's kind of fascinating. So B is imaging, and I always remember that because I think, oh, when we get our picture taken, we want to look beautiful. So it starts with a B. And we are going to be looking at the liver, how fluoroscopically, and then they different ways that we can do that is via contrast. We have high and low contrast, other contrast, and guidance. Remember, with just about every one of the code sets, when you see the term other, that means we have specificity, we just don't have a code for it yet. So we know it's very common to have high and low osmolar contrast, and also sometimes there's guidance involved. But as they add different types of contrast, then maybe it'll be added to the code set, maybe next year. We'll be talking about it then. New technology. Now, this is the last of the new areas, of the new codes. But don't think we're over, because there is a lot of new technology codes. In fact, every year that they add new codes to PCS, predominantly most of them is in new technology. That's pretty fascinating. And what it tells us as we look at this, it tells us what's happening. All the other code sets that we're using throughout the year allows for us to see what works, and then following it up with the diagnosis code to show what we're curing. Or stabilizing or treating. It's pretty fascinating. And the first area that new technology in is extirpation. And remember what that was. Now, mm, I started breaking this down, making this a little bit smaller, and then I'm not going to use it as much because again, you're going to see how this is repetitious. I'm For the most part, when we do these updates, it's just to let you be aware that these exist, right? That these new codes are available to you. But PCS is a little different, is that you build the codes as you go when you're coding. It's not like you remember that if we're working with abdominal aorta, it's X2C PT3T7, right? No, you go to X2C and then you start filling in the blanks with P3T7, right? Okay, so we're looking at extirpation. What body areas? We have the abdominal aorta, right upper extremity, left upper extremities, and then we're going to lower extremities with the laterality and great vessels. Notice there at the bottom. Now, what makes the difference in those? Either we're using computer aided mechanical aspiration, or we are using, well, it says it's on all of those. So some we're doing percutaneous approach, and looks like they're all percutaneous approach. It's cool. Then we move to inspections. What are we inspecting? The heart. What are we doing with the heart? How are we doing it? Transthoracic echocardiograph computer-aided guidance. Very fascinating. I would think that was used quite a bit. If I'd had a little more time, I might have looked and seen what would have been the code that would have captured that in the past, last year before that. So again, because I think computer aided guidance doing this is pretty common. So now we got a code for it. Then we're still working on the cardiothoracic area bypasses, right and let's see, right radical artery using thermal resistant energy percutaneous, and then bypass. I should have taken the bypass out, but left radial artery. So we have the right and we have the left, and they're only way that we can get into them with this code is percutaneous approach. And then we also have a replacement. Did you even know they can replace the thoracic artery arch? Wow, I didn't even know that you could do that. And so they are using branch synthetic substitute with intraluminal device. We know what an intraluminal device is inside the tube, open approach. And most likely, this is a procedure that we hadn't been able to do before, or maybe it's something new, and I suspect it's always open approach. I wouldn't imagine they could do it any other way yet. They're replacing the aortic arch. Wow. And then we have a restriction. Now, we've talked about restrictions before. Restriction is not the same as occlusion. Still, fluid can get through the lumen on a restriction. So we're looking at the coronary sinus with reduction device, and we have percutaneous approach, but we can also do thoracic artery descending using branched synthetic substitute with intraluminal. We know what all that means, open approach. And this is kind of an example of doing a restriction by putting a stent in there. And again, the blood still goes through. It's not occluded, it's not bypassed, it is just restricted. Moving on, we can monitor. What do we monitor? Well, there's a lot of things we monitor in the body. And here we're doing the GI, upper GI and lower GI oxygen saturation, and then the different approaches. And then we can also do an irrigation of the lower GI. Again, what are we doing? Lower GI irrigation, right? We're putting fluid up in there somewhere using intraoperative single-use over sleeve via natural artificial opening endoscopic, meaning endoscoping, we're going and we're looking while we're doing it. That's pretty cool, huh? Inspection. This is looking at the liver. We're looking at the hepatobiliary duct. That's that little duct between the liver and the bile duct. And we're going to use a duodenoscope, single use. And then we can also look at the pancreatic duct, single use duodenoscope. And do you know where the duodenum is? That's what where the duodenum scope is, where you're going in and looking at that. Pretty cool. Replacement. What are we going to replace? Skin. And so this would predominantly be burn victims, most likely, with bioengineered allogenic construct external approach, right? Because we're just laying it on top of them. Reposition. This was kind of interesting. So we can do the vertebra at the lumbar and the thoracic area. We're going to go in posteriorly, which means from behind. Dynamic. I'm not really sure what the dynamic signifies. You'd have to do a little research on your own to see that. But it is a distraction device, and then there's different approaches that we can use. Notice there is open and percutaneous approach. I really thought that it would be endoscopic would be in there, but I guess if we're repositioning, then we're not really going in and looking while we're doing it, and it's posterior, so you're just right there on the spine. But that was pretty fascinating. And I can't help but, of course, I love PCS, right? It makes so much more sense to me than CPT. However, when I look at these, my ICD-10 CM, my diagnosis brain is looping around saying, now, why would we do that? Well, what's the disease? The disease process, right? And again, it makes sense because these two code sets go together really, really well and communicate well, where CPT really doesn't. So now we're moving on, new technology, and we're looking at fusions. So the different areas are thoracolumbar and lumbar. So again, know the divisions of the spinal column. The thoracic is at the chest. So we have at the top, we have cervical, then we have thoracic, then we have lumbar, and then we get into sacral after that. So yeah, right there at that area where you have the closeness of the thoracic and the lumbar. So it's the top of the lumbar, and then the lumbar. What are we doing? Well, of course, we're fusing, and we're using customizable intrabody fusion device for every single one of these. And then there's different approaches. So the location, thoracolumbar or lumbar, we're using the same fusion device, and then different approaches for these new. And again, I wanted to add that on there to show you how they do it. It's kind of cool what they do. And spines, I love the spines, but I do not like procedures on the spines. Not many things gross me out, but working on the spine is kind of creepy to me. I don't know why. Now we can do more. Fusions are continued. And so now it's similar in every way, except for we can do 2 or more lumbar joints, and then lumbosacral. So again, that's the bottom area of the lumbar. And this is a great vision of a view of lumbosacral, because there's the sacrum that is like a solid piece there. Same thing, customizable inner body fusion devices, and then different approaches where we can do that. Now, this is getting close to the end, because what we're doing now is introductions, and these introductions, very fascinating, because when we introduce something to the body, a lot of times we're just injecting them, and that's kind of what most of these are. So our approaches are a little bit different. It says, into skin, percutaneous, external approach, and just kind of pay attention to those. But notice that this is a drug or a chemical that we're putting into the body. So the very first one is Brolein enriched proteolytic enzyme into the skin external approach. So they're rubbing it on, right? So that's it's an enzyme. Wow, how cool is that? So the new technology isn't the approach or anything else. It's the chemical or the drug that we're actually putting and introducing into the body. And they're always dumping new drugs or to us. So again, I'm not going to read all of these. Some of them I probably can't even pronounce, but I do want you to pay attention to that. A couple of them are enzymes, and notice that the first and that third one, they're the same thing, except for one's in the skin, external approach, and the other one is subcutaneous tissue, external approach. So again, they're getting it into subcutaneous, not just the surface skin. Really, really cool. I think that is all that I wanted to tell you about that. Notice at that though, third from the bottom, XW033G7, allogenic engineered chimeric antigen receptor T cell immunotherapy. If you don't know much about T cells, it has a real close relationships to a immunotherapy, and they're always doing stuff with immunotherapy. So that's kind of interesting. You notice several of those last two are immunotherapy also. Now, this is more than one slide of all of these different medications that have been added. And for the most part, if you see them repeated, the drug repeated, the only reason that you're seeing that is because the approach is different. Okay. Or where they're putting it. And this also is an introduction, not of the actual chemical or drug, but we can also introduce into the body a bone filler. So look at this last one: antibiotic eluting bone void filler into bones, open approach. And now, of course, when they inject it in with the needle, that probably isn't open approach, unless they have to literally get in there with the needle after they open you up and fill in the crevices. So it's like sealing your basement, right? Or how they seal up the asphalt and fix cracks in people's driveways and on the road. And then that wedge that you see there is actually an image of this bone void filler. And I think what happens is they get this wedge of substance and then they pulverize it, if I'm not and mix a liquid with it, and then they inject it or use it, paste it. There's kind of some really interesting things that they do. But ultimately, what I think this is this antibiotic eluting is a new type, I believe. And I'm kind of guessing there, but you can do more research on your own to see. Next, we move into transfusions. What are we transfusing? Mostly it looks like immunoglobulin is the new codes. We have different approaches, but it's different doses and types of immunoglobulin. Some are intravenous, high dose, hyperimmune, and again, where we're putting it into a peripheral vein and into a central vein. Again, that's immunoglobulin. If you haven't ever dealt or studied that, that's a fascinating world as well. And then insertion, we can put in a neurostimulator lead. What I thought was interesting, we've been doing neurostimulators in a lot of places. They do them up by the brain. They put them in the spine and in the back for lumbar pain. I know several people that have those. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But now this one is for the mouth and the pharynx. And I couldn't figure out why we would put a neurostimulator in the mouth or the pharynx unless it has something to do with being able to swallow. And maybe it has to do with that. So that was kind of interesting. New technology. Do some research in there and see if you can find out more about that. The technology does measurements, intracranial vascular activity, pulmonary artery flow, infection, mechanical initial specimen diversion technique. Let's see, instead of vascular flow for intracranial, we have arterial flow, serum plasma, nanoparticle, wow, right? And fluorescein means that it probably glows, but I underline SARS-CoV-2. That's for COVID-19. And then the nasopharynx fluid, uh, uh, and that is measurement. What are we doing? We're testing for COVID. So we can do it serum plasma and we can do it nasopharynx. Now that's where they stick the stick in your nose to your brain practically, and they look for the uh, COVID-19, which is SARS-CoV-2. That's why there's a new code for testing for that. Extracorporeal introduction, and it's nafamostat anticoagulant. Never heard of that. That would be a fun thing to go look up as well. And that's it, guys, but that's not all. I'm going to downsize that. That is all of the new stuff. And I also wanted to show you, let me just get my cursor going here. These are all of the codes that are in 2022, the number of codes. So there's a little over 78,000 codes for PCS. Now, that's not the new changes and everything. That's total for 2022. Because again, there wasn't a whole lot of new codes and changes, but now let me get my cursor. Come on, mouse. I want to show you. There's the X. Sorry about that. Now I wanted to show you, let's see. PCS actually has the way to build a code. And if you wanted to know more about that first character, notice these are the first characters, all the divisions in PCS. There was nothing new in obstetrics. There was nothing in, let's see, chiropractic or osteopathic, no nuclear medicine. I think last time we had a lot of nuclear medicine stuff. So no mental health, substance abuse treatment, most of the majority of the new stuff happened in med surg, which is we had some administration, and then new technology. That's the primary of what we had. Then let's see, changed codes. We had only 63 changed codes, and for the most part, just kind of letting you see real quick, it looks like adenoplastic area was introducing into those. There was down here just some introductions. Let's see, most all of that. Adenoplastic would be for cancer treatments. And then down at the we had all of it was introduction. So everything that was changed was a 3 code, and it had to do with cancer treatments. And then just briefly to kind of give you a highlight of the deleted codes. Now, notice that with deleted, again, I said sometimes you'll have a code deleted in ICD or CPT because a new code's created that's expanded, but that's not really the way that this worked. We did have bone marrow, right? Transfusion, they did change up that a little bit, but again, most of this is all transfusion stuff. You'll see that they made those, but there's some introductions, and notice that these are some drugs. That was a large area, and so anyway, again, I thought that was fascinating, but I just wasn't going to put that on the slide deck because there really wasn't that much that would pertain, and you can always check those to see what you need more information on. And I think that's going to wrap us up. Did we have any questions before I end this for us all? All right. Well, again, it didn't take as long as I thought because there just wasn't that many new codes and changes, which is a good sign for us. Happy fall, guys. I'm glad that we've been able to get the code sets updated for you. Go in and see in the club, and you'll see our other updates that we've done. And if you are following us on YouTube, don't forget to hit the thumbs. That helps us quite a bit. Feel free to share this with others, and I hope that you'll join us with our next presentation starting next week. See you guys. Bye.
Do you need more medical certification and business training? Learn more at www.cco.us.